His mother had taken his hand when he was 9, pressed his small palm flat against the limestone wall of a boarding house cellar in Yankton. The stone was cool and steady. The air smelled of potato skin and lamp smoke. She was a laundress who kept her explanations short because she was always carrying something heavy from one room to the next. She said 5 words. Below ground keeps count. Remember. He did not understand her then. Years later, shaking in the corner of a roofless church with a town's worth of locked doors behind him and nothing ahead but open prairie, he pressed his hand to the stone floor and felt the earth answering back. Tom Rourke had been in Bredahl Crossing for 11 days before anyone learned his name. He had arrived on the last freight run before the October blizzard buried the railroad cuts, riding in a cattle car with 6 other men who scattered into the prairie dark at Tracy and left him holding a railroad pry bar, a tin cup, and 17 cents. He was 16. His father had died under a rolled wagon near the grading line east of Huron. His mother had died in Yankton during a fever winter when he was 12. He had no land claim, no church membership, no letter of introduction, no relatives anywhere between the Missouri and the Minnesota state line. He had a coat patched with flour sacking and an army surplus blanket that smelled of another man's tobacco. For 11 days he had survived by shoveling snow from the rail platform in exchange for a place on the freight shed floor. He ate what the section foreman left on a tin plate outside the shed door: cold potato, sometimes a crust of bread soaked in bacon grease. Once a lump of salt pork so hard he had to hold it against his chest to warm it enough to chew. He did not complain. He did not ask for more. He kept his blanket rolled tight, his pry bar within reach, and his mouth shut. That arrangement ended on a Wednesday night when the temperature dropped below 0 and sleet began driving sideways across the rail yard. Tom had pressed himself behind a stack of crates in the freight shed corner, blanket wrapped double, knees drawn up, breathing into the wool to trap whatever warmth his body still made. The shed walls were pine planks with gaps wide enough to slide a hand through. Wind came through those gaps like water through a sieve. The sleet hit the tin roof so hard it sounded like someone throwing gravel. He heard the bolt slide before he saw the lantern. Deputy Alva Noyes came through the freight door with a lamp in one hand and a hickory stick in the other. He was not a cruel man. He was a tired man doing a job that no one thanked him for, and he had been told by the town board that the freight shed was not a flop house. "Up," Noyes said. Tom stood. His knees cracked. His fingers had gone white at the tips. "You cannot stay here," Noyes said. "Board says the shed is railroad property, and railroad property is not for lodging." Tom picked up his blanket and his pry bar. He did not argue. Arguing with a deputy in a town where you owned nothing and knew no one was the fastest way to see the inside of a root cellar used as a jail. Outside, the sleet hit his face like thrown sand. His coat stiffened within 30 seconds. He stood on the platform and looked down the single street of Bredahl Crossing, a furrow of frozen mud between 2 rows of frame buildings, most of them dark, a few showing the faint orange of kerosene lamps turned low to save fuel. Rufus Cale stood in the doorway of his general store, arms crossed, watching. He had seen Noyes enter the shed. He had waited. "Boy," Cale called across the wind. Tom turned. Cale was 44, thick through the chest, with a ledger keeper's squint and a creditor's patience. He owned the only general store within 30 miles. He sold flour, coffee, kerosene, nails, tobacco, and credit. The credit was the real product. Half the families in Bredahl Crossing owed him money, and the other half owed him favors. "If we feed every stray boy off the rails," Carl said, loud enough for Noyes to hear, "we will bury our own children by March." He closed his door. The bolt shot home. Tom stood in the sleet. 17 cents. A pry bar. a blanket freezing to his shoulders. The nearest town was Ordway, 19 miles east across open prairie. In clear weather, a strong man could walk it in 6 hours. In a whiteout, a strong man could walk in circles until he sat down and never stood up. Tom was not a strong man. He was a thin boy with blistered feet and a coat that had stopped keeping out wind 2 weeks ago. He could not stay. He could not leave. He could not pay for shelter. He could not earn shelter because every job in town, shoveling, hauling, splitting, had been claimed by men who owned property and had families to protect. A boy with no settlement rights was not a worker. He was a mouth. Tom walked. He walked past the last frame house on the west end of the street, past the livery where horses stamped and blew steam in the dark, past the frozen creek bed where ice had formed in shapes that looked like grabbed hands. He walked until the buildings ended and the prairie began, and then he kept walking because there was one structure left. The old fieldstone church sat half a mile beyond the last house, on a low rise near a wagon ford that nobody used anymore. It had been built in 1873 by Scandinavian and Yankee settlers who wanted God close to the crossing. It burned in a grass fire in 1877. The new town grew east toward the rail platform, and the blackened chapel became a dare, a place children bet each other to enter and touch the altar stone. What remained was this: 3 walls of field stone standing to about 8 feet. The fourth collapsed to waist height. No roof, black rafters jutting like broken ribs against whatever sky showed above. A stone floor covered in soot, old snow, and the droppings of animals that had sheltered there before Tom. He climbed through the gap in the west wall and dropped into the nave. The wind was still brutal, but the 3 standing walls cut the worst of it. He found the southeast corner where 2 walls met at full height, and he pressed his back against the stone and pulled the blanket over his head and sat there, shaking, with his teeth hitting each other so hard he tasted blood. This was the arithmetic Elias Mott had explained to him 3 days earlier. Mott was 58, a former freighter who had driven ox teams across Nebraska before the railroad made him obsolete. He served as town board chairman because no one else wanted the job and because he understood supply lines the way a surgeon understands veins. He had stopped Tom outside the store and spoken to him with the blunt courtesy of a man delivering a verdict he believed was merciful. "Food is arithmetic, boy," Mott had said. "A town needs flour, meat, beans, coal, and teams. You have a blanket and a crowbar." He had not said it with malice. He had said it the way a man says the river is frozen, as a fact that does not care about your feelings. The town needed 80 to 100 pounds of dry food per day to keep 163 people alive on starvation rations. The store had less than 2 weeks of supplies if divided honestly. The railroad was buried under 15 to 25 feet of drifted snow in the cuts east of town. No train had passed since before Christmas. The telegraph worked when the wind did not tear down the wire, which meant it worked about 4 hours in 10. Mott's arithmetic was simple. Every mouth in town was a subtraction. Tom was a mouth without a corresponding hand that anyone would hire. He was negative value. He was a number that made the equation worse. Tom understood the math. He had understood it since Tracy. What he could not accept was the conclusion. The conclusion was that he should walk into the prairie and subtract himself, and he was 16 years old and not ready to become an absence. So he sat in the corner of a burned church and shook. Sometime after midnight, the sleet stopped. The clouds cracked. Starlight came through the open roof and made the snow on the stone floor glow a dull blue. That was when Tom noticed it. Near the southeast corner where he sat, the snow was thinner. Not gone, thinner. A few feet away, in the center of the nave, snow had accumulated 2 inches deep and crusted over. But here, Along the base of the wall and across a rectangular section of floor about 4 feet by 6 feet, the snow was soft, wet, and melting at the edges. He pressed his hand flat against the stone floor. It was not warm. Nothing in Dakota Territory in January was warm, but it was warmer than the stone 3 feet away. It was warmer than the air above it. It was warmer than the wall beside it. It was the difference between a stone that has been sitting in a root cellar and a stone that has been sitting in a snowbank, and the difference was enough to melt sleet and keep snow from crusting. Tom pulled his hand back and stared at the floor. He had spent 4 years sleeping in sheds, freight cars, livery lofts, and under porches. He knew cold the way a fish knows water. He knew that the ground beneath a building holds whatever heat the earth gives it, and the earth gives its heat grudgingly, but it gives it. His mother had taught him that. In a boarding house cellar in Yankton when he was 9, she had taken his hand and pressed it flat against the limestone wall. "Feel that," she had said. "Above ground lies, below ground keeps count." He had not understood her then. She was a laundress who spoke in fragments and kept her explanations short because she was always working. But the memory was in his palm, the cool steadiness of underground stone, the difference between air that moves and earth that stays. Tom scraped at the floor with his fingernails. Soot came away in black streaks. Beneath the soot, the flagstones were cut. Not random field stone, but squared and fitted. He scraped harder. The rectangle became clearer. One edge showed iron staining, a rusty brown line that ran the length of one stone. He pulled the pry bar from his belt. The bar was 3 feet of forged steel, tapered at one end, bent at the other. It was the only thing of value his father had owned that Tom had been allowed to keep. Railroad men had taken the tools, the boots, the wages owed. A boy got what a boy could carry, and Tom had carried the bar because it was useful and because his father's grip had worn the handle smooth. He worked the tapered end into the seam between 2 flagstones. The stone did not move. He shifted his weight, leaned, pushed. A corner lifted a 1/4 inch. He jammed a chunk of frozen wood under it and pried again. The stone rose an inch, 2 inches. Beneath it, more stone. But set into the stone, half hidden by soot and ice, was an iron ring. The ring was black with rust, but intact. It was bolted through a plate set into a larger flagstone, a hatch, or the top of something meant to be opened. Tom cleared the ice around it with the pry bar's edge, cutting his fingers on the stone, breaking a thumbnail against the iron. He used the frozen wood chunks as cribbing, lifting each stone fraction by fraction, bracing and prying and bracing again. The work took more than an hour. His hands bled. His arms shook from effort and cold and hunger. Twice the cribbing slipped, and the stone dropped back, and he had to start again. He nearly quit after the second collapse. He sat back on his heels and looked at the ring and thought about Mott's arithmetic and Cale's closed door and the 19 miles of whiteout between him and the next town. Then he grabbed the ring with both hands, braced his feet against the adjacent stone, and pulled. The hatch cracked open. What came up was not a blast of heat. It was a breath, a slow, steady exhalation of air that was warmer than anything Tom had felt in weeks. Around 50 degrees, he guessed later, though in that moment it felt like standing near a stove. His eyelashes thawed. The moisture on his cheeks turned from ice to water. The air smelled of dry earth, old wood, and something faintly mineral, lime, maybe, or chalk. Below the hatch, stone stairs descended into dark. They were narrow and steep, worn smooth at the edges. He could see 3 steps before the dark swallowed the rest. Tom did not have a lantern. He did not have a candle. He had a pry bar, a blanket, and 17 cents. He went down anyway. He went down by feel, one hand on the stone wall, one foot testing each step before committing weight. The stairs turned once, a quarter spiral, and then opened into a space he could sense by the change in echo. The sound of his breathing went from tight to hollow, from a stairwell to a room. He struck a match. He had 4, kept in his tin cup with a scrap of waxed paper. The match flared, and in the 3 seconds before it burned his fingers, he saw the vault. A chamber lined with fieldstone vaulted overhead, perhaps 10 feet wide and 20 feet deep. 2 side alcoves. A shallow drain cut through the floor, and along both walls, stacked on stone blocks raised 6 inches off the ground, barrels. The match burned out. Tom stood in the dark, heart slamming, and lit the second match. Barrels. Oak barrels with pitch-sealed lids, marked with faded symbols he could not read in the guttering light. He counted what he could see before the flame reached his fingers. 17 barrels on the left, more on the right. Sacks behind them stacked against the far wall. The match died. He had 2 left. He climbed back up the stairs, pulled the hatch until only a hand-width gap remained, and sat beside it in the dark. The warm air seeped through the gap and pooled around him. For the first time in 11 days, he stopped shaking. He did not sleep. He sat with his back against the wall and his hand on the pry bar and thought about what might be in those barrels. He thought about Cale's closed door and Mott's arithmetic and noise dragging him into the sleet. He thought about his mother's hand pressing his palm to stone. Above ground lies. Below ground keeps count. At first light, Tom went back down. He had traded his second-to-last match for a candle stub from a boy at the livery 2 days earlier, a transaction he had forgotten until this moment. The candle was 1.5 inches long, tallow, and it smelled like rendered beef. He lit it with his third match and descended. In candlelight, the vault took shape. The chamber was built with care that had nothing to do with accident. The walls were double-coursed fieldstone, tight-fitted, with lime mortar between courses. The vault ceiling was a low arch, not high enough to stand fully upright at the edges, but solid. The weight of the church floor and the earth above it pressing the stones into permanent compression. The floor was flagstone with a shallow drain channel running to one corner, where a pipe or gap led somewhere Tom could not see. The air was cool and dry, not warm by any measure that mattered above ground, but down here, where the earth held its own temperature below the frost line, 50 degrees felt like rescue. He examined the barrels. The first row, left side, 17 oak barrels, each about the size of a flour barrel, sealed with pitch and marked with a cross and what looked like a date. He pried the lid of the nearest one carefully, using the flat of the bar to avoid cracking the wood. Inside, salt pork, packed in brine. The brine was clear. The meat was gray-white, submerged with no scum on the surface and no smell beyond salt and fat. He touched the surface of the liquid. Cold. Still. Second row, right side. 14 barrels, slightly smaller. He opened one. Dry beans, hard, dark, rattling against each other when he tilted the barrel. No clumping, no mold smell, no dampness on the wood interior. Against the far wall, 22 containers, a mix of barrels and heavy sacks, filled with wheat. He bit a kernel. Hard. Dry. It cracked between his teeth with a clean snap. He smelled the sack interior, grain, dust, nothing sour, nothing musty. 2 barrels near the drain had cracked. Inside, the remains of apples had turned to dark mush. Unusable, fermenting, with a vinegar smell that stung his nose. 3 salt sacks near the back had hardened into solid blocks, fused by moisture that had crept in through a wall seam. And nailed inside a wooden box on the wall near the stairs, a ledger. Tom held the candle close and read the first page. The handwriting was cramped and faded, the ink brown with age. The date was 1876. The heading read, Winter Relief Stores for Congregation and Strangers. Tom closed the ledger. He pinched out the candle to save what was left. He stood in the dark beneath a burned church in the middle of the worst winter in Dakota Territory memory, and he did the arithmetic. The arithmetic said he was not standing in a grave. He was standing in a storehouse that someone had sealed and forgotten. The arithmetic also said that if he was wrong about any of it, if the pork had turned, if the wheat had molded beneath the surface, if the beans held poison he could not smell, then he was not standing in a storehouse. He was standing in a tomb, and anyone who ate from it would follow him in. He climbed the stairs and pulled the hatch shut behind him. He took one small sack of wheat, enough to fill his tin cup 3 times, and tucked it inside his coat against his chest. He scattered broken pew boards over the hatch and kicked soot across the disturbed flagstones. Then he walked back toward town in the gray dawn light, and he said nothing to anyone. Hannah Vale saw him first. She was 15, the daughter of a widowed washerwoman named Clara Vale, and she was crossing the frozen street between the boarding house and the livery with a bucket of ice she intended to melt on the stove. She saw Tom coming from the direction of the old church, which nobody visited, carrying a small sack close to his body the way a man carries something precious or stolen. Hannah was not suspicious by nature, but she was hungry by circumstance. Her mother washed clothes for 3 families and earned barely enough to keep their room at the boarding house. Her sister Mabel was 8 and had not eaten a full meal in 5 days. When you are hungry and you see a boy carrying a sack from a ruin, you do not think discovery, you think theft. She watched Tom pass without looking at her. She noted the flour dust on his sleeve. She noted the way he held the sack, not loose like a boy carrying a prize, but careful, like a boy carrying evidence. She said nothing that morning, but she remembered. By the time Tom reached the freight shed, his plan was already failing. He had no way to grind the wheat. He had no fire. He had no pot. He had a tin cup and raw kernels and the knowledge that somewhere beneath a ruined church sat enough food to feed the town, and the certainty that he could not simply say so. If he told Rufus Cale, Cale would seize it. The store was the only distribution point. Cale controlled who ate and who waited, and he had already made clear that credit went to landowners first, widows and laborers last, and orphan railroad boys never. If he told Elias Mott, Mott would call a board meeting. The board would want inspection, verification, debate. They would send men to examine the vault, and those men would track through the wheat with muddy boots and open barrels without checking seals, and declare everything unsafe because it came from a ruin, and the food would be condemned or confiscated while families starved above it. If he told anyone at all, word would spread in an hour. Hungry men do not wait for inspection. They break doors. They tear through barrels. They eat whatever they find, and if a single barrel was bad, a single piece of pork rotten beneath the brine, people would sicken and the entire cache would be blamed. Tom would be blamed. The boy who fed poison to the town from a grave beneath a church. He needed proof. He needed 1 clean barrel of beans, 1 sample of wheat that could be ground and cooked and eaten without sickness, 1 pork barrel with clear brine and no foul smell, tested and tasted before any authority saw it. He needed to prove the food was safe with his own body before he asked anyone else to trust it. And he needed to do it before someone found the vault without him. That afternoon, Tom tried to buy a pinch of yeast at Cale's store. He had no money for yeast. Yeast cost 4 cents, and he had 17, and he needed those 17 for emergencies he could not yet name, but he thought he might trade labor. He had shoveled before. He could shovel again. Cale looked at him from behind the counter. The store was dim, kerosene rationed, and the shelves behind Cale were half empty. 4 sacks of flour visible, a few tins of lard, a crate of candles, a barrel of cornmeal with the lid ajar. The store smelled of dust and old wood and the sour tang of worry. No yeast for trade, Cale said. No flour either, cash or credit. Credit requires a claim or a cosigner. Tom turned to leave. As he did, Cale's hand shot out and grabbed his sleeve. Where did you steal that? Tom looked down. Flour dust. On his sleeve, where the wheat sack had pressed against his coat. Fine, pale, unmistakable. From a place you forgot, Tom said. It was the wrong thing to say to a man who made his living remembering what people owed him. Cale's grip tightened. His eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth to call for noise. Elias Mott stepped through the store door at that moment, stamping snow from his boots. He saw Cale holding Tom's arm. He saw Tom's face. Not frightened, Mott noticed, but calculating. A thief's face would show fear. This boy's face showed the particular stillness of someone deciding how much to reveal. Let him go, Rufus, Mott said. Cale released Tom's sleeve, but did not step back. He has flour on him, Cale said. Nobody gave him flour. He found something or stole something, and either way it belongs to the town. Mott looked at Tom. Boy, if you have found any food, any stores, any cash, anything at all, you bring it before the board for inspection. That is the rule. You do not distribute food in this town without board authority. If you do, I will have Noyes put you in the cellar for theft. Tom said nothing. If the food is real and safe, Mott continued, the board will decide its use. If it is contaminated, you will answer for endangering lives. Do you understand? Tom understood. He understood that Mott was offering him a legal path that would put the food in Mott's hands. He understood that Cale wanted the food in Cale's hands. He understood that neither of those hands would open first for the people who needed it most, the children eating wheat scrapings, the widows with no credit, the laborers whose strength was failing because Cale fed landowners first. I understand, Tom said, and walked out. Hannah Vale had been standing near the store window, not inside but close enough to hear through the gaps in the frame wall. She watched Tom leave. She noticed again that he was not eating. A boy who had found food and was stealing for himself would show it. Crumbs on his chin, a fullness in his movements, the particular carelessness of someone whose belly is no longer screaming. Tom showed none of that. He was gaunt, careful, and moving with purpose. That night, Rufus Cale told 2 men, a teamster named Garrett, and a farmhand who owed Cale a season's wages, to follow Tom's tracks toward the church. If you have ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building, tell us in the comments. Tom had one night to prove this was not madness. The snow started again before midnight. Not a blizzard, but a steady fall that filled tracks within an hour. Garrett and the farmhand followed what they could see of Tom's boot prints as far as the creek bed, lost the trail where wind had swept the ice clean, circled the old church in the dark without entering, and returned to Cale's store with nothing but frozen ears and foul tempers. But they had seen the church. They had noted the gap in the west wall. They had kicked at the snow near the entrance and seen that someone had been there recently, cleared a path, moved debris, left marks in the soot. Cale filed this away. Tom, meanwhile, had not gone to the church. He had anticipated the followers, not because he was clever, but because he had spent 4 years living in places where people wanted him gone, and a boy who does not learn to watch his back does not survive to 16. He had walked toward the church, cut east along the creek bed where wind erased tracks, circled south, and returned to the livery where he slept behind the hay bales with his blanket over his head and the pry bar across his chest. He'd taken one handful of wheat from the sack hidden inside his coat. He chewed the kernels raw, one at a time, grinding them between his back teeth until they became a paste he could swallow. It took 20 minutes to eat a handful. The wheat tasted of dust and earth and something faintly sweet. His stomach cramped from the rawness of it, and he curled on his side in the hay and waited for the pain to pass. This was his test. If the wheat was bad, he would know by morning. If the wheat was good, he would know what to do next. He did not sleep well. His ribs ached from the cold. His cut fingers throbbed. The livery was warmer than the freight shed had been, but not warm enough to stop the shivering. Horses shifted and stamped in the dark around him, and their breath made clouds that drifted up toward the rafters and disappeared. Before dawn, Tom opened his eyes. His stomach hurt, but no worse than hunger always hurt. No cramping beyond the familiar ache, no nausea, no fever. The wheat had not made him sick. He ate another handful, chewing slowly. Then he tucked the sack inside his coat and slipped out of the livery before anyone stirred. The wind had shifted overnight. It came from the northwest now, driving the new snow into drifts along the east side of every building. The sky was a flat iron gray from horizon to horizon. Tom could not see the old church from where he stood, but he knew the direction, and he walked it. He had to be inside the vault and working before full light. He had to inspect more barrels, separate the damaged stores from the intact, and find a way to prove safety without a kitchen, a stove, or a single ally in a town that thought he was either a thief or a fool. The church ruin appeared out of the gray like a shipwreck rising from a frozen sea. Black stone walls crusted with ice, rafters pointing at nothing, snow filling the nave in sculpted drifts, except in the southeast corner, where the hatch breathed its steady warmth and kept the snow soft and thin. Tom climbed through the gap, crossed to the corner, cleared the pew boards he had scattered the night before, and pulled the hatch open. Warm air rose around him. He descended. At the bottom of the stairs, in the vault that held a town's worth of forgotten food, Tom lit his last candle stub and began the work that would decide whether he lived or died, and whether 163 people who did not want him would eat or starve. He started with the worst barrel first. He started with the worst barrel first. That was not instinct. It was logic, the kind that comes from years of eating whatever's available and learning the hard way which food fights back. If you open the best barrel first, you eat. If you open the worst barrel first, you learn. Tom needed to learn before he ate, because every barrel he approved would go into the mouths of people who had no idea what they were trusting. The 2 cracked barrels near the drain were obvious failures. He had already smelled the apple mush, vinegar, and rot sharp enough to sting, and he left those alone. The 3 fused salt blocks were useless for anything except propping up a platform. He dragged them aside with the pry bar. That left the pork. 17 barrels. Tom started with the one closest to the drain, the most vulnerable position in any cellar. Damp travels. Water finds the lowest point. A barrel sitting at the low end of a stone floor for 5 years would absorb whatever moisture seeped through. He pried the lid. The pitch seal cracked in a clean line, a good sign, meaning it had not been softened by water intrusion. Inside, the brine surface was cloudy, not the clear, still brine of the barrel he had checked the night before. This brine had a yellowish tinge, and when Tom lowered his face to the opening, the smell hit him like a hand. Sour, not the clean salt smell of preserved meat, but something underneath, a sweetness that had gone wrong, like fruit left in a warm room for weeks. He did not touch the meat. He replaced the lid, took a piece of charcoal from the church floor above, and marked the barrel with a thick black X. Second barrel, same position, east wall, seal intact, brine clear, smell, salt, fat, nothing else. He pressed a finger to the surface and tasted. Brutally salty, but clean. He marked this one with a single line. Third barrel. Seal cracked at one corner, brine level low. The barrel had leaked sometime in the past 5 years. The exposed meat above the brine line had turned dark and dry, and when he prodded it with the pry bar, it crumbled. Below the brine, the submerged meat looked intact, but he could not trust it. A barrel with a broken seal was a barrel with a question mark. He gave it an X. He worked through all 17. The candle burned down to a nub of tallow, barely wider than his thumbnail. 3 barrels were clearly spoiled. 2 more were suspect, seals compromised, brine levels low, meat exposed to air at some point. 12 barrels appeared sound, sealed, full brine, clear liquid, salt smell without sourness. But appearing sound and being safe were different problems, and Tom knew it. He moved to the beans. 14 barrels. He opened each and ran his hands through the contents. Hard beans rattled, soft beans clumped. He bit samples from each barrel, cracking them between his teeth. 11 barrels held beans that were hard, dry, and odorless beyond the faint earthy smell of dried legume. 3 barrels showed damp clumping and a musty odor. The seals had held, but moisture had crept in through the wood itself over the years. He marked the 3 with charcoal X marks and pushed them toward the drain side. The wheat took longest, 22 containers, barrels and heavy sacks mixed together. The sacks were the bigger risk. Cloth breathes, and breathing lets moisture in. Tom opened each sack and plunged his hand to the bottom, feeling for damp, for clumping, for the warmth that meant mold was working even when you could not see it. He bit kernels and smelled the grain at the bottom of every container. 18 were sound. 4 showed signs of moisture damage, softened kernels at the base, a faintly sweet smell that Otto Whitcomb would later teach him to identify as the first stage of mold colonization, though he did not know the word then. He only knew it smelled wrong. He marked them. By the time he finished, the candle was gone. He worked the last 3 sacks by touch and smell alone, crouching in the dark with his hands in grain up to his wrists, listening to the steady drip somewhere in the back of the vault and the wind howling through the roofless church above. He climbed the stairs, pulled the hatch nearly shut, and sat against the wall while dawn crept over the prairie and turned the inside of the church from black to gray. He had a count: 12 sound pork barrels, 11 sound bean barrels, 18 sound wheat stores, and a question he could not answer alone. How long did this food last? Who did it feed? And how could he prove it would not kill them? That morning, Ada Whitcomb came to the church. She came because Hannah Vale told her mother, and her mother told Ada, and Ada was the kind of woman who walked toward trouble instead of away from it. She was 62, stiff in the left knee where she had slipped on river ice outside Winona 12 years earlier, and she had the hands of a woman who had spent 40 years lifting pots, kneading dough, scrubbing laundry, and butchering hogs. She had cooked for freighting crews on the Minnesota road before her husband brought her west. She had run a church poor box in a town that no longer existed. She had buried her husband the previous April and remained in Bredahl Crossing because she could not afford to leave and had no one left to leave for. She found Tom sitting against the church wall with charcoal on his hands and the look of a boy who had been awake all night making decisions too large for one person. "Hannah says you are stealing from a grave," Ada said. Tom looked up. "No graves down there, just barrels." "Barrels of what?" "Pork, beans, wheat, stored before the church burned." Ada studied him. She did not sit down. She did not offer comfort. She looked at his hands, the charcoal marks, the cut fingers, the broken thumbnail, and she looked at the scattered pew boards that did a poor job of hiding the hatch. "Show me," she said. Tom hesitated. Every person who saw the vault was a person who could talk. Ada was a widow with no power and no credit. She owed Cal for a winter's worth of candles and firewood. She had no reason to protect Tom and every reason to trade information for favor. Why? He asked. Because a hungry thief opens the first barrel, Ada said. A careful man opens the worst one first. She nodded toward his charcoal-marked hands. You have been sorting. Tom pulled the pew boards aside and opened the hatch. Ada lowered herself through the gap with a grunt of pain from her knee and descended the stairs one step at a time, one hand on the stone wall, while Tom followed with a candle he had taken from the livery that morning in exchange for his last match. In the vault, Ada did not exclaim. She did not praise. She walked the length of the chamber, touched the walls, looked at the ceiling arch, checked the drain, and then turned to the barrels. She examined Tom's charcoal marks. She opened one of the X-marked pork barrels and smelled it, then closed it immediately. Turned, she said. 3 months past saving, maybe more. She opened one of the barrels Tom had marked with a single line. She studied the brine surface. She dipped a finger and tasted. She pressed the surface of the meat and watched the brine close over the indentation. This one lives, she said. The seal held and the brine stayed strong. Whoever packed this knew what salt does. She moved to the beans, opened an X-marked barrel, scooped a handful, held them to the candlelight. See the dark spots? Mold. Not on the surface, inside the skin. These are dead. She dropped them back and wiped her hand on her skirt. She opened a clean barrel and did the same inspection. These crack dry. These you can cook. She turned to Tom. How many did you mark bad? 3 pork, 3 beans, 4 wheat. How many did you eat? Wheat only, raw. A handful last night, a handful this morning. No sickness. Ada nodded slowly. Show me the ledger. Tom pulled the box from the wall. Ada held the ledger close to the candle and read the first page aloud, moving her lips slightly, squinting at the faded ink. Winter relief stores for congregation and strangers, she read. Sealed August 1876. Pork from the Grindheim slaughter, beans from the Haugen harvest, wheat from Tivite and Brecke farms. She turned the page. Inventory lists, quantities, dates packed. She closed the ledger and looked at Tom. Someone planned this. Someone built this vault under a church, stored provisions, sealed them, and wrote it all down. And then the church burned and the town moved and everyone forgot. Or chose to forget, Tom said. Same result. Ada put the ledger back in its box. Here is what I know. I have cooked for 40 years. I have fed men who ate worse than this and lived, and I have seen men eat better than this and die because the barrel was wrong. I can tell you which barrels are safe, but I cannot tell you all of them are safe. Some will look good and turn bad in the cooking. Some will look bad and cook clean. Can you teach me? Tom asked. I can teach you enough to not kill anyone today. Tomorrow is tomorrow's problem. She taught him pork first. Check the pitch seal before anything else. A broken seal means air reached the brine, and air brings rot. Smell before touching. If the nose says no, the hand does not go in. Look for cloudy brine and understand the difference between cloudiness from salt settling and cloudiness from spoilage. Salt clouds are white and sink. Spoilage clouds are yellow or gray and float. Keep the meat submerged. Any piece above the brine line is a piece that has been dying since the seal broke. If the brine smells sour, the barrel is done. Do not argue with your nose. She made Tom repeat each step while she watched. He opened a barrel, checked the seal, smelled, looked, pressed the meat. She corrected him twice. once for reaching in before smelling, once for tilting the barrel to see the bottom instead of ladling brine aside. You tilt a barrel, you move the brine, she said. You move the brine, you expose the meat. You expose the meat, you start the clock. Every second that pork sits in air instead of salt, it gets closer to killing someone. She taught him beans second. Split a bean with a knife. Look at the inside. If it is uniform in color, it lived clean. If there are dark threads or soft spots, mold got inside. Bite a bean. If it cracks sharp, it is dry enough. If it bends before breaking, it held water too long. Smell the barrel at the bottom, not the top. Mold starts where moisture gathers, and moisture gathers low. She taught him wheat third. Bite the kernel. A clean crack means dry. A soft give means moisture. Smell the grain at the bottom of every sack. Sweet wheat smells sweet and feeds a town. Cellar mold wheat smells like a damp rag and buries one. Now count, she said. Tom counted. Ada counted with him, marking a piece of barrel stave with charcoal as they went. 12 pork barrels sound, 3 suspect, 2 condemned. At roughly 130 pounds of usable meat per barrel after brine loss, the 12 good barrels held about 1,560 pounds. The suspect barrels might add another 250, or they might add nothing. 11 bean barrels sound, 3 condemned. Each barrel held roughly 80 to 100 pounds. 11 good barrels meant somewhere between 880 and 1,100 pounds of beans. 18 wheat stores sound, 4 condemned. The quantities varied. Some barrels were full, some sacks half depleted by whoever had last drawn from them before the church burned. Ada estimated the sound wheat at roughly 3,000 pounds, give or take what rodents or settling had taken. Total usable food, about 5,800 pounds, maybe more, probably not less. How long does that feed 163 people? Tom asked. It does not, Ada said. Not if you mean full bellies. It feeds them enough to not die if they eat careful and waste nothing. At emergency rations, bean broth, wheat mush, pork for flavor, and fat. You can stretch a pound of dry food to feed 4 people one meal, maybe 5 if you water the broth. She did the math on the barrel stave, scratching numbers with charcoal. Call it 1,400 meals per day for the town at one meal. That is, she paused, calculating. Roughly 4 pounds of mixed food per meal served. She shook her head. The numbers are rough, but this is weeks, several weeks, not months. And only if the board does not waste half of it in a panic. The board will not get it, Tom said. Ada looked at him. The board will get it, boy. The question is when and how. If Rufus Cale gets it first, the widows eat last. If the board inspects it properly and Elias Mott has a shred of decency left, the children eat first. And if I prove it is safe before any of them see it, then you walk into that board meeting with a cooked pot and a clear conscience, and you say, I ate it. I am standing. Open the door. They worked together the rest of that day. Tom cleared more snow and soot from the hatch area while Ada supervised from the nave floor, unable to climb the stairs more than twice without her knee seizing. He disguised the hatch under broken pew boards, arranged to look like a collapsed section of roof. He propped the hatch with a stone wedge so it would not slam shut if the wind caught it. He cleared a blocked rear flue, a ventilation shaft that ran from the vault to the exterior wall, by poking through a dead animal nest with the pry bar and testing the airflow with candle smoke. The flame flickered toward the flue. The air moved. The vault could breathe. Ada insisted on the ventilation. A sealed room with people in it is a room that kills people in it. The air goes bad before the food does. By late afternoon, Tom had separated the condemned stores from the sound ones, built a raised platform from salvaged pew boards to keep the good sacks off any damp that might creep along the floor, and carried the 3 suspect pork barrels to a separate alcove where they could be tested individually without contaminating the main supply. His ribs ached from where he had slipped on the stairs that morning, catching himself on the stone wall and bruising his side against the edge of a step. His hands were raw. His stomach growled. He had eaten nothing but raw wheat all day, and the kernels sat in his gut like gravel. Ada brought him a cup of broth she had heated at the boarding house. Hot water with a piece of salt pork from one of the good barrels, boiled for 20 minutes over a scrap fire behind the church wall. The pork dissolved into the water, turning it cloudy and rich with fat. Tom drank it in 4 swallows and felt warmth spread through his chest like a second heartbeat. "Now we wait," Ada said. "If that pork kills you, I will know by morning." "And if it does not?" "Then we cook enough for 3, and we see if it kills me and the Veil girl." Tom slept in the church that night, curled beside the hatch with warm air seeping over him. He woke twice, once from cold when the wind shifted and drove snow through the open roof, once from a dream where his mother pressed his hand to a wall, and the wall was not stone but ice, and the ice cracked, and below it was dark water with barrels floating in it. He woke at dawn. He was not dead. His stomach ached from hunger, but not from poison. Hannah came at first light, carrying her mother's coffee mill. "I'm not helping you," she said, standing in the gap in the west wall with snow in her hair and the mill clutched to her chest like a weapon. "I am trading. You have wheat. My mother has been grinding seed wheat in this mill since flour ran out. Mabel has not eaten real food in 5 days. If you have what you say you have, I grind wheat for you and my sister eats first." "Your sister eats first," Tom agreed. Hannah ground wheat while Tom cracked pork from the second-tested barrel and soaked it in snow melt. Ada arrived at mid-morning, moving slowly, her knee worse in the cold. She built a fire in the sheltered corner behind the east wall, using broken pew wood and a covered kettle she had carried from the boarding house. They cooked 3 separate batches. Bean broth first, a handful of sorted beans soaked overnight in a pot Tom had left by the hatch, then boiled until they softened. Wheat mush second, Hannah's ground flour mixed with snow melt and heated until it thickened. Pork broth third, 2 chunks of salt pork soaked in fresh water to draw out excess salt, then simmered until the fat rendered and the broth turned opaque. Tom ate first, a full bowl of each. He sat against the church wall with steam rising from the tin cup and ate slowly, tasting each bite, waiting for the twist in his gut that would mean he had been wrong. Ada ate second. She ate without ceremony, the way a woman eats who has fed others all her life and knows that food is not a gift but a fact. Hannah ate third, but only after she had taken a bowl of wheat mush to the boarding house for Mabel. She returned an hour later and said that Mabel had eaten 3 spoonfuls and kept them down and was sleeping. They waited through the night. Tom in the church, Ada in the boarding house, Hannah beside Mabel. No one got sick. By morning, Tom had his proof. The pork was edible. The beans were edible. The wheat was edible. 3 people had eaten, slept, and woken without cramps, fever, or worse. The vault held food that could sustain a town. But the town did not know that yet, and the town did not trust the boy who slept in ruins. Elias Mott refused to see Tom. The board had met the previous evening, without Tom, without invitation, and declared that any food found on town land was communal property subject to board inspection. The church ruin sat outside the town plat, technically, but Mott argued that proximity and original construction by townspeople made it a community asset. Rufus Cale went further. He told men at his store that morning, "That boy has found something that belongs to the town. which means it belongs in responsible hands. He meant his store. He meant his shelves, his locks, his distribution list. Ada countered the only way she could Auntwijk by speaking to the people Kyle did not bother to control. She told Clara Vale. She told the widow Andresen, whose husband had frozen on the track clearing crew 2 weeks earlier. She told the old Norwegian farmer Peder Haugen, whose family name was on one of the barrel labels in the vault, and who sat very still when he heard it and said nothing for a long time. The telegraph line failed that afternoon. A wind shift drove snow into the railroad cut until it packed higher than a locomotive pilot. 2 men sent to clear track came back with frostbitten fingers, and the news that the drift extended for 3/4 of a mile. A third man, the farmhand who had followed Tom's tracks for Cull, said the snow was so deep in the cut that he could not see the rails. Bredahl Crossing was sealed. Then Mabel Vale collapsed. She collapsed in the boarding house hallway between the stove and the door, falling forward onto her hands and then slowly sideways until she lay on the floorboards with her eyes open and her breathing shallow. She had not eaten since Tom's wheat mush the day before. Before that, 5 days of weak tea and scraps. She was 8 years old and weighed less than a large dog. Hannah ran for Cale's store. She begged for flour. Cale looked at the child and said he could advance flour if Clara Vale signed over her sewing machine and pledged future laundry wages as credit. Clara Vale's sewing machine was the only thing she owned that was worth more than the clothes on her back. It was the tool that kept her family in the boarding house instead of on the street. Hannah did not sign. She ran to the church. Tom was in the vault checking the ventilation flue when he heard her calling from above. He climbed the stairs and saw her standing in the nave with snow blowing around her, tears frozen on her face, her voice cracking. "Mabel fell," Hannah said. "She will not stand up." Tom looked at Ada, who had been sitting by the fire mending a sack. Ada looked back. "1 kettle," Ada said. "Bean broth and pork fat, enough for a child. We carry it to the boarding house and we dare Mott to arrest us." They made the broth in 20 minutes. Ada supervised every step. Beans from the tested barrel, pork from the tested barrel, water boiled hard, fat skimmed and stirred back in for strength. Tom carried the kettle wrapped in his blanket to keep it warm. Hannah walked ahead. Ada followed behind, moving as fast as her knee allowed. The boarding house was a 2-story frame building near the center of town, owned by a man named Drucker, who had left for Huron in November and not returned. His wife ran the rooms. 6 families lived there, sharing a kitchen, a stove, and a privy. The hallway smelled of wet wool, coal smoke, and the particular staleness of people who have not eaten enough to generate body heat. Elias Mott was at the door. Not by coincidence. Someone had seen Tom leaving the church with a steaming kettle and sent word. Mott stood on the boarding house steps with his coat buttoned to his chin and his hat pulled low, and the expression of a man who had made a rule and now had to enforce it against a child. "That food has not been inspected," Mott said. Tom held the kettle. Steam leaked from under the lid. "Arrest me after she eats." Mott did not move. Ada stepped forward. She did not touch Mott. She stood close enough that he could smell the broth and spoke in a voice that carried down the hallway behind him, where Clara Vale was kneeling beside Mabel and 2 other women were watching from their doorways. "The pork was soaked overnight and boiled for 20 minutes, Ada said. "I checked the seal myself. The brine was clear and the meat was submerged. The beans were from a dry barrel, raised off the floor, no mold visible or by smell. I sorted them by hand. The wheat was ground this morning. Tom ate it yesterday. I ate it yesterday. Hannah ate it yesterday. We are standing." She named each step the way a woman names ingredients in a recipe she has made 1,000 times, not to impress, but to account. Each fact was a plank in a bridge she was building between Tom's kettle and Mabel's mouth. Mott looked at the kettle. He looked at Ada. He looked down the hallway to where Mabel lay on the floor and Clara Vale held her daughter's hand. He stepped aside. Tom knelt beside Mabel and held the cup while Clara lifted her daughter's head. The broth was warm, not hot, cooled by the walk through the wind. Mabel's lips cracked when they parted. She drank one spoonful, then two, then three. The broth ran down her chin, and Clara wiped it with her sleeve and said nothing, because what could she say to a boy she had never spoken to who was feeding her child from a tin cup in a hallway? Mabel kept the broth down. The boarding house erupted. Within an hour, every family in the building knew. By evening, half the town had heard some version of the story. The boy had found food under the burned church. The boy had a cellar full of barrels. The boy had fed a dying child. The food was safe. The food was poison. The boy was a savior. The boy was a con man. The boy was insane. Rufus Cale heard the news in his store and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, he called Garrett and 2 other men. "That cellar is town property," Cale said. "Every barrel in it belongs to Bredahl Crossing, and Bredahl Crossing means the board, and the board stores food in one place." He pointed at his own shelves. "Here." Garrett asked what they were supposed to do. "Go to the church," Cale said. "Bring the barrels to my store, all of them. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next choice decides whether the vault becomes a lifeline or a riot." The blizzard arrived that night. It did not announce itself. There was no wall of cloud, no dramatic darkening of the sky. The wind simply increased. The temperature dropped from 12 below to 26 below in less than 3 hours. Snow that had been falling vertically began driving horizontal, and within an hour the street between the store and the boarding house was invisible. Men tied ropes between buildings, a practice Tom had heard about but never seen, running lines from doorpost to doorpost so that anyone who needed to cross the 50 feet between structures could hold the rope and not walk off into the white void and die 30 yards from safety. Livestock bawled under drifted roofs. Chimneys clogged with blown snow and had to be cleared from inside with poles, filling rooms with smoke before the draft resumed. The church ruin half a mile beyond the town disappeared entirely, a hump of white among white humps, indistinguishable from the prairie. The blizzard lasted 9 days. Not a single day of heavy snow followed by clearing. 9 days. The wind did not stop. The temperature did not rise above 15 below for the duration. Snow accumulated not in inches but in geography. The world changed shape. Buildings became hills. Fences became lines in a white field. The railroad cut became a canyon filled to the brim. One account from a nearby settlement described farmers digging tunnels from their house doors to their barns because the surface was impassable and the livestock had to be reached or they would die where they stood. In Bredahl Crossing, the crisis was not snow. It was food. Cale's store had less than 10 days of supply before the blizzard started. By the second day, it had 7. By the 4th day, it had 5. Cale rationed with the precision of a man protecting his investment. Landowners first, credit holders second, laborers third, widows and children wherever they fit. The families with no credit received half portions. The families with nothing received what Cale called charitable allocation, which meant whatever he chose to give, when he chose to give it, in exchange for whatever future obligation he chose to name. Tom could not reach the church. For the first 2 days, he tried. He tied a rope to the livery doorpost and walked into the wind, paying out line, but the rope ran out before he reached the creek bed, and the visibility was so poor that he could not see his own hand at arm's length. He returned to the livery with ice in his eyebrows and blood on his lips where the cold had cracked them. On the third day, the wind shifted enough to create a brief corridor of reduced snowfall, not calm, but less than lethal. Tom, Ada, and Hannah made the walk together. Tom led, using the pry bar as a probe to test the ground ahead. Ada held a rope tied to Tom's waist. Hannah held the other end. They reached the church ruin and found it transformed. Snow had drifted into the nave until only the top 3 feet of the walls were visible. The hatch was buried under 4 feet of packed snow. Tom dug for 40 minutes with the pry bar, and his hands, scraping and gouging through crusted layers until he found the pew boards, and beneath them the hatch, still propped with its stone wedge, still breathing that steady 50-degree air into the ice above it. Below, the vault was untouched. The temperature had not changed. The barrels sat on their stone blocks. The drain ran clear. The ventilation flue wheezed faintly with the pressure difference between the underground chamber and the storm above. They loaded what they could carry: 1 bean barrel, 1 wheat sack, 2 pork pieces wrapped in cloth. Hannah carried the wheat against her chest. Tom carried the barrel on his back, bent double against the wind, the weight grinding into his spine. Ada carried the pork and the kettle and moved so slowly that Tom had to stop twice and wait, watching her shape materialize out of the white like a ghost assembling itself from snow. They made it back to the boarding house. That night, they fed 42 people. Not the whole town. The boarding house residents, the widow Anderson and her 3 children from the house next door, the track crew who had been sleeping in the telegraph office, bean broth with pork fat, wheat mush, served in cups, bowls, tin plates, and 1 empty cigar box that a child held out because she had nothing else. Elias Mott came to the boarding house that night. He stood in the kitchen and watched Tom ladle broth from the kettle into Clara Vale's chipped bowls. He watched children eat. He watched the widow Anderson weep into her cup. He watched Ada taste each batch before it was served, the same way she had tasted every batch, checking for the wrongness that would mean a barrel had turned. Mott asked to see the vault. Tom said, "Tomorrow, if the wind drops." The wind dropped enough on the 5th day for a party of 5 to make the walk. Tom led. Mott followed. Ada followed Mott. 2 neutral witnesses, Peter Haugen and a blacksmith named Orphan, came behind. Inside the vault, the contrast hit them physically. Above, ice in eyebrows, hands numb in mittens, lanterns blowing out. Below, dripping stone, visible breath fading, barrels dry to the touch. Mott ran his hand along the wall and felt the steady coolness of earth-tempered stone, neither warm nor freezing, just constant. He opened the ledger. He read the heading. He read the inventory. He turned to the final page and stopped. "Mott," he said quietly. He was reading his own surname. The ledger listed contributors. Stone hauled by A. Mott, Elias's older brother, Arnie, dead 6 years, who had helped build the vault before the railroad moved the town. Elias closed the ledger. He stood in the underground chamber where his brother had hauled stone and looked at a 16-year-old boy who had found what the town forgot and kept it safe when no one helped him. He did not apologize. He was not that kind of man. He said, "Show me which barrels you rejected." Tom showed him the X-marked barrels, the suspect pork in its separate alcove, the fused salt blocks, the ruined apples. He explained each mark, each test, each decision. He spoke the way Ada had taught him, by the evidence, not by hope. Mott said, "Open the suspect pork." Tom pried the lid. The brine was low. The exposed meat was dark. The smell was not rot, but not right either. A borderline case, the kind that could go either way. "Your judgment?" Mott asked. "Reject it," Tom said. "If I am wrong about 1 good barrel, people eat less. If I am wrong about one bad barrel, people die. Mott looked at Ada. Ada nodded. Reject it, Mott said. On the way back, fighting through waist-deep snow and gray light that made the world look like the inside of a bowl, one of Cale's men, Caleb Arter, appeared on the path. He had been sent by Cale to follow the group and claim whatever they carried. He saw the barrel on Tom's back and lunged for it. Arter was a large man, heavy through the shoulders, and he grabbed the barrel with both hands. Tom braced. The barrel shifted. Arter's foot hit ice beneath the snow, and he went down hard, his ankle folding under him with a sound like a green branch snapping. He screamed. The lantern he carried flew from his hand and rolled, the flame guttering. Tom set the barrel down. He crouched beside Arter, who was gasping and clutching his ankle and cursing with the desperate monotony of a man in real pain. Tom looked back for Cale, but Cale was not there. Cale had sent Arter. Cale had not come himself. Tom and Orrin the blacksmith carried Arter back to town between them. Tom on one side, Orrin on the other, the injured man's arms over their shoulders, his broken ankle dragging a furrow in the snow. Mott carried the pork barrel. Ada and Hogan walked behind with the lantern. They brought Arter to the boarding house and set his ankle with a plank and strips of blanket. Tom brought him a cup of broth from the kettle. Arter drank it without meeting Tom's eyes. By the sixth day, the rationing system was working. Tom, Ada, and Hannah made the vault run every other day, loading what they could carry, cooking in the boarding house kitchen, serving in order. Children first, nursing mothers, elderly, sick, then the work crews who cleared chimneys and dug paths and tied new ropes when old ones buried. By the eighth day, every family in the ration line knew Tom's name. By the ninth day, when the wind finally dropped and the sky cracked open to reveal a sun so bright on the snow that it burned the eyes, Bredahl Crossing was still standing. Gaunt, exhausted, hungry in a way that would take weeks to fade, but standing. 42 people had eaten from the vault on the first night. By the end of the blizzard, the number was 97. The vault had not created abundance. It had created time. Enough time for the wind to stop. Enough time for the track crews to begin clearing snow from the railroad cut. Enough time for the telegraph line to be spliced and a message sent east requesting emergency provisions. Enough time for no one to die of starvation in a town that had been 11 days from empty when the blizzard sealed the doors. The vault did not save Bredahl Crossing because it was magical. It saved Bredahl Crossing because the earth beneath a burned church held a constant temperature, and the people who built the vault had packed barrels with enough salt and sealed them with enough pitch and stored them below the frost line on raised stone blocks with proper drainage. And because a boy with no name in this town had opened the worst barrel first and marked it with charcoal instead of eating it in the dark. Tom stood in the church ruin on the morning the blizzard broke. The three walls of the nave rose above him, crusted in ice, the black rafters reaching into a blue sky that felt like a lie after 9 days of white. The hatch was open. Warm air rose in a column and turned to mist when it met the frozen air above. Below, in the vault, the barrels sat on their blocks. Fewer now, lighter, but still there, still counted, still marked. Rufus Cull had disappeared during the storm's worst night. Not literally. He was in his store, doors locked, stock diminished, ledger open. But he had stopped sending men. He had stopped making claims. He had watched the town walk past his store to the boarding house and eat from barrels that he did not control, and every bowl served was a transaction that bypassed his shelves. He had the original ledger page jarred, the one Tom had found in the wall box, the one that read, "For congregation and strangers." He had taken it from the vault on the 5th day when the inspection party left, pocketing it while Mott read the inventory and Tom watched the barrels. No one had noticed. The page that proved the vault was meant for everyone, including the orphan, the widow, the stranger, was in Rufus Cale's desk drawer, and Cale was waiting for the right moment to rewrite the story. The aftermath was not relief. It was exhaustion so deep it had its own weight, pressing on the town like a second winter. People emerged from buildings on the 10th morning and stood blinking in sunlight that hurt after 9 days of white blindness. Children cried at the brightness. Men who had spent the blizzard clearing chimneys and digging paths leaned against walls and did not speak. The snow had reshaped Bredahl Crossing into something unrecognizable. Roof lines buried, fences vanished, the street a canyon cut between drifts taller than a man on horseback. Tom did not rest. He could not. The vault was still open, still feeding people, and the moment he stopped counting barrels was the moment someone else would start. 3 days after the blizzard broke, Elias Mott called a public meeting in the boarding house kitchen. Every adult who could walk attended. They stood in the hallway, crowded into the kitchen, sat on the stairs. The room smelled of boiled wheat and sweat, and the sweet rot of frostbitten toes that 2 men were trying to hide inside their boots. Mott stood by the stove. He was not a man who gave speeches. He gave reports. He had spent 40 years reading ledgers and counting loads, and he trusted numbers the way a preacher trusts scripture, not because they were kind, but because they did not lie. "I told this boy food was arithmetic," Mott said. He did not say Tom's name immediately. He said, "this boy," and the room knew who he meant because every person in it had eaten from Tom's kettle. "I told him a town needs flour, meat, beans, coal, in teams. I told him he had a blanket and a crowbar." He paused. The stove ticked as the metal expanded. "I was right about the arithmetic," Mott said. "I was wrong about the boy. He knew something I had forgotten. Arithmetic does not matter if pride keeps you from opening the door." He did not soften after that. He did not turn the moment into gratitude. He turned it into structure. He announced that the vault would remain under Tom's management, with Otto Whitcomb supervising food safety. He announced that distribution would follow the order Tom had established. Children, nursing mothers, elderly, sick, then work crews. He announced that any person who attempted to move barrels from the vault to private storage would be treated as a thief. He looked at Rufus Cale when he said the last part. Cale stood in the doorway, arms folded, face unreadable. He said nothing. Mott gave Tom authority over the vault inventory. Not ownership, authority. The distinction mattered. Tom did not own the food. The food belonged to the town, as Cale had insisted, but the town's food would be managed by the person who had found it, tested it, and fed a dying child before the board gave permission. Tom accepted with 4 words. The ledger stays open. He meant the vault ledger, the record of every barrel opened, every ration served, every rejection marked. He had been keeping it since the 3rd day, scratching entries on barrel staves with charcoal. Ada had made him start a proper count on paper taken from Drucker's abandoned desk in the boarding house. Every name, every portion, every date. Anyone could see it. Anyone could check. This was not generosity. It was defense. Tom understood at 16 what some men never learn. The only protection a person without power has is transparency. If every barrel was accounted for, no one could accuse him of hoarding. If every portion was recorded, no one could claim favoritism. The ledger was his answer to every suspicion that a boy with nothing must be stealing something. The community came to the vault in waves. First came the practical questions. Peter Haugen, the old Norwegian farmer whose family name appeared on the original barrel labels, climbed down the stairs with the careful deliberation of a man entering a church. He touched the barrels his father had helped fill. He examined the stone walls, the drain, the ventilation shaft. He asked Tom how the cellar stayed above freezing. Tom showed him. He pointed at the depth, 8 feet below the surface, below the frost line, where the earth held a temperature that did not follow the seasons. He showed the stone mass above, the church floor and walls that insulated the chamber from surface wind. He showed the drainage channel that kept water from pooling. He showed the ventilation flue that allowed air exchange without creating a draft that would pull cold air in. He showed these things by pointing, by demonstration, by leading Haugen through the space the way Ada had led him, hands on stone, eyes on the evidence. He did not lecture. He could not have lectured. He did not have the vocabulary for it. He knew what worked because he had tested it, not because he understood the science behind it. The earth was warm at depth. The stone kept the warmth in. The drain kept the water out. The vent kept the air clean. These were facts he had learned with his hands. Hogan asked, "Can other homes build this?" Tom said, "Smaller. Not as deep, maybe, but the same ideas. High ground, not a hollow. Food off the floor. Air from 2 directions. Dry grain away from wet roots." Hogan nodded and climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the wall, and did not speak again until he reached the surface, where he turned to Tom and said, "My father would have been glad you found it." That was the first conversion, not dramatic, not tearful, just an old man acknowledging that the thing his family had built still worked, and that the boy who discovered it had treated it with the respect it deserved. Hannah's conversion had already happened, though neither of them would have called it that. She had started as a suspicious girl watching a boy carry a sack from a ruin. She had become a trading partner when Mabel needed food. She had become a working partner during the blizzard, grinding wheat and sorting beans and carrying supplies through whiteouts. By the time the storm broke, she did not need a conversion scene. She needed a title. Tom gave her one without ceremony. She kept the ration books, every name, every portion, every day. Her handwriting was better than his. The wider community came next. Families Tom had never spoken to appeared at the boarding house kitchen, where rations were served twice daily. They stood in line with bowls and cups and asked questions that were really requests for reassurance. Is the pork safe? How old are the beans? Did you check the wheat for weevils? Tom answered each question by showing, not telling. He brought a sample of tested wheat to the kitchen table and let people crack kernels between their teeth. He opened a bean barrel and invited anyone to smell the interior. He showed the charcoal marks on rejected barrels and explained what each X meant. He brought the spoiled pork barrel, sealed, condemned, marked, and let people smell the difference between good brine and turned brine. This was not performance. It was the only way he knew to build trust. Words from a 16-year-old orphan meant nothing. Evidence meant everything. Measurable results accumulated. After 10 days of rationing from the vault, no deaths from starvation in the central town. 2 frostbite amputations that would have been deaths if the victims had not been fed before the track clearing work. 14 households receiving daily rations. 3 spoiled barrels rejected publicly, the contents dumped in the snow where anyone could see them, proving that Tom was not hiding risk or cutting corners. Wheat mush and bean broth became the daily base. Not enough. Never enough. People were hungry every hour of every day, and the portions were small: a cup of broth, a bowl of mush, a sliver of pork fat for those doing heavy labor. But hungry is different from starving. Hungry is a complaint. Starving is a countdown. The vault had stopped the countdown. But Rufus Cale had not stopped. He adapted. He could not seize the vault by force. Mott had made that clear, and the town's mood had shifted against him. He could not starve Tom out. Tom ate from the vault like everyone else. He could not discredit the food. 97 people had eaten it without sickness, so he found a different angle. He started a rumor that Otto was too old to judge spoiled meat. He told men at his store that a 62-year-old woman with a bad knee could not possibly inspect barrels properly, that her senses were dulled by age, that Tom was relying on a widow who could barely climb stairs. He phrased it as concern. "I worry about the old woman's eyes," he said. "I worry about what she might miss." He also began offering to professionally manage distribution from his store. The infrastructure was there, he argued. Shelves, scales, a lock on the door. The vault had no lock. Anyone could climb down those stairs. Was the town really going to trust its food supply to an open hole in the ground, guarded by a boy and a crippled widow? The argument was reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. Cale was not wrong about the vulnerability of the vault. He was wrong about the solution. Moving the food to his store meant moving it above ground, into freezing air that would burst brine barrels and crystallize beans and ruin the stable storage conditions that had kept the food safe for 5 years. It meant putting distribution back under Cale's control, back behind his counter, back on his credit ledger. Tom said no. Ada said no. Mott, to Cale's fury, said no. The vault stays underground. The food stays in stable conditions. Distribution stays at the boarding house. Cale retreated to his store and waited. The mentor relationship deepened in the weeks after the blizzard, not through grand moments, but through the accumulated weight of shared work. Ada and Tom spent hours in the vault each day, checking barrels, rotating stock, recording withdrawals. She taught him to read moisture by the way light reflected off grain. Dry wheat scattered light, damp wheat absorbed it. She taught him to judge a barrel's condition by the sound it made when tapped. A full barrel rang dull, a half-empty barrel rang hollow. A barrel with gas building inside from spoilage gave a sound she described as the voice of a drunk man trying to sing. She told him about Minnesota, about the freighting crew she had cooked for, 30 men who ate 4 meals a day and complained about everyone, about the church poor box she had managed, how she learned that feeding people fairly was harder than feeding them well, because fair meant saying no to people who thought they deserved more, about her husband, who had been a quiet man who built things and never finished them. 3 cabins started, 2 abandoned, the 3rd burned before the roof was on. He was a good man who could not complete a thought, she said. I loved him for starting and stayed for the wreckage. Tom told her about his mother. Not much. He did not have much to tell. The cellar in Yankton, the laundry work, the fever that took her in 3 days, the way she spoke in fragments because she was always moving, always working, always carrying something heavy from one room to another. She told me the earth keeps count, Tom said. I did not know what she meant until I opened the hatch. She meant that what you put underground stays honest, Ada said. Above ground, people lie about what they have. Underground, the food tells you the truth. They disagreed once, badly, during the 3rd week after the blizzard. A barrel of pork that Tom wanted to approve showed borderline signs. The brine was slightly cloudy. The seal had a hairline crack, but the meat smelled clean and felt firm. Tom argued that the town was hungry and the barrel was likely safe. Ada argued that likely was not the same as safe, and that one bad barrel would destroy every ounce of trust they had built. You want to feed people, Ada said. I want to keep them alive. Those are not the same thing on a bad day. Tom rejected the barrel. He dragged it up the stairs and dumped it in the snow in front of 3 witnesses and hated every second of it because the meat looked fine and smelled fine and would probably have been fine. And meanwhile, children were eating half portions because the supply was shrinking. Ada watched him dump it and said, Good. Now do it again tomorrow if you have to. She was right. He knew she was right. The trust mattered more than the calories. But knowing she was right did not make the hunger in the ration line easier to watch. Ada gave Tom her late husband's pocket scale during the 4th week. It was a small brass balance with a set of iron weights, the kind a merchant uses to weigh powder or gold dust. She placed it in his hand and closed his fingers over it. Feeding people is harder than finding food, she said, because hunger turns honest people into liars. They will tell you their child is sicker than she is. They will tell you their neighbor took more than his share. They will tell you the portions are too small. Even when the portions are equal, the scale does not argue. Use it. Tom used it. He weighed portions at the boarding house kitchen, not because anyone accused him of unfairness, but because the scale removed the argument before it started. A measured portion was a portion no one could dispute. The brass gleamed in the lamplight, and families watched the weight settle, and even the suspicious ones fell silent because the numbers were visible. Ada's knee worsened through the thaw. She had been walking to the church ruin almost daily, climbing those narrow stairs, crouching beside barrels, and the cold and damp and effort accumulated in the joint until she could not straighten her leg fully without a sound that Tom could hear from across the vault. She did not complain. She compensated, leaning on walls, sitting on barrels to inspect them, letting Tom do the lifting while she supervised from a stone ledge near the stairs. But the cough started in late February. It was a small cough at first, the kind that comes from breathing cold air too long and standing in wet wind during the drain rescue. She had spent 2 hours in sleeting rain clearing the vault's drainage channel when spring melt threatened to flood the lower alcove. Tom had begged her to go inside. She had refused because the drain required judgment, which stones to shift, which to leave, where the water needed to go. And she did not trust Tom to make those decisions alone yet. The cough settled in her chest and did not leave. By the first week of March, she was spending half the day in the boarding house, sitting near the stove with a blanket on her shoulders, marking the ration ledger from memory while Hannah read her the barrel counts Tom brought each evening. She still supervised. She still tasted broth before it was served. She still said no when Tom brought a questionable sack of wheat, her nose sharper than his even from 6 feet away. But she was fading, and Tom could see it the way you see a candle flame thinning in a draft. The light's still there, but less of it, and less steady. She called him to her chair on a morning when the snow outside was melting in streaks down the boarding house windows, and the icicles on the eaves dripped fast enough to sound like rain. "Listen," she said, and coughed and continued. "Never let gratitude become a new kind of debt." Tom sat on the floor beside her chair, the way he had sat beside the hatch that first night. "People will thank you," Ada said. "They will call you the boy who saved the town. They will give you credit you did not earn and blame you for failures you did not cause. If you let them owe you, they will either worship you or hate you. There is no middle." She paused to breathe. The sound was wet. "Turn the vault into a shared system. Teach others to inspect. Teach others to count. Give the scale to Hannah when I'm gone, and make sure 3 people know every step. If only one person knows how to check a barrel, that person becomes a tyrant whether he wants to or not." "You are not gone," Tom said. "I am going," Ada said, with the patience of a woman who had watched enough death to recognize the early stages of her own. "Not today, maybe not this month, but the cough is here, and the cough does not leave at my age." Tom said nothing. He sat beside her chair and listened to her breathe, and the sound of melting water outside made the silence feel like something cracking. That was the last long conversation they had about the vault. After that, Ada's teaching happened in shorter fragments. A correction when Tom tilted a barrel, a word when Hannah miscounted a portion, a shake of the head when a suspect sack was brought near the approved stores. She communicated in gestures and glances, conserving breath the way you conserve fuel in a long winter, because breath had become a resource she could not replenish. The secondary crisis came in the second week of March, when a fast thaw flooded 3 low-lying dugouts east of town. The families in those dugouts, 2 with children, 1 elderly couple, lost everything below floor level. Potatoes stored in earthen pits turned to mud. Bedding rotted. One family's seed grain, saved from autumn for spring planting, was ruined in 4 hours by water that rose through the packed earth floor and did not stop until it reached the sleeping platforms. Hannah brought the news to Tom at the vault. The Andresen cellar is flooded. The Brecka dugout is knee-deep. Old Tollef's place has water at the doorstep. They need dry storage and they need food, and they need it before tonight because the temperature is dropping again and wet clothes kill faster than empty stomachs. Tom stood in the vault among the diminished barrels. The supply had been shrinking for weeks. The town was still eating from it daily, but the portions were smaller now, and the barrels that remained were the last line before the railroad opened. He had been guarding them the way Ada had taught him. Slowly, carefully, 1 day's ration at a time, never opening a new barrel until the current one was empty. Now 3 families needed food and shelter in the same hour. He remembered Ada's rules. Inspect first. Separate damage from sound. Count in meals, not barrels. Refuse panic. He could not ask Ada. She was in the boarding house, coughing into a cloth, too weak to walk to the church. He had to decide alone. He opened 2 barrels, 1 bean, 1 wheat, and portioned emergency rations for the 3 families. He carried the food to the boarding house himself, through streets running with snow melt, his boots soaked, the sacks wrapped in oilcloth torn from a barrel cover. But the families needed more than food. They needed dry space. The church vault was the only dry, above-freezing storage in the area, and it was already serving as the town's food supply. Tom made the decision. He cleared the southern alcove, the one that held condemned stores and empty barrels, and told the flooded families they could store seed grain and dry bedding there, not living space, not sleeping quarters. The air was too close for that, and the stairs were too narrow for families with children. But dry storage, yes. A place to put the things that would keep them alive when the water receded and the planting began. The Andresen widow brought her seed wheat, what was left of it, and Tom inspected it the way Ada had taught him. Most was ruined, swollen and clumped and smelling of mud, but 4 sacks stored higher than the others in the dugout had survived. He bit kernels, hard, clean. He approved them and placed them on the raised platform in the southern alcove. Old Tollef brought nothing but himself and a carved wooden box that he held against his chest, the way Tom had held the first wheat sack. Inside the box was a family Bible and a set of silver spoons that his wife, long dead, had brought from Norway. Tom did not ask about the box. He found a dry shelf and set it there and said nothing. That night the temperature dropped again. A late freeze, the kind that catches the unwary after thaw, has softened their vigilance. Water that had been running through the streets turned to ice. Puddles became hazards. The wet clothing of the flooded families began to stiffen. Tom built a fire behind the church wall and heated stones in it. He carried the hot stones down into the vault and set them on the floor of the southern alcove, creating a pocket of warmth that would last through the night. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was the difference between a family sleeping in frozen cloth and a family sleeping in damp cloth, and damp cloth could be survived. He worked alone. Otto was not there. Hannah was at the boarding house with Mabel. Mott was organizing track crews for the next day's clearing work. Tom carried stones until his arms shook and his back seized, and he had to sit on the vault stairs with his head between his knees and breathe until the dizziness passed. He thought about Ada's instruction. Never let gratitude become a new kind of debt. He thought about the 3 families who would wake up tomorrow and look at him as the person who saved their seed grain and their dignity. He thought about the weight of being the only one who knew how the vault worked, and how that weight was a trap disguised as a gift. Tomorrow he decided he would teach the Anderson boy to inspect barrels. He would teach Tollef's granddaughter to check wheat for moisture. He would teach Hannah's system of record keeping to at least 2 more people. The knowledge had to spread, or it would become a chain. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the storm comes. The next morning, Rufus Cale made his last serious play. He had been quiet since the blizzard. Quiet, for Cale, meant planning. He had watched Tom's authority grow. He had watched the town bypass his store for the vault's rations. He had watched his credit leverage dissolve as families who owed him money ate food that cost them nothing. Every bowl of bean broth was a lost transaction, and Rufus Cale was a man who counted transactions the way other men counted heartbeats. His plan was simple and vicious. He took a piece of pork from his own stores, from his own back room, cut from a barrel he had bought before the blizzard at railroad prices, and placed it near the ration table in the boarding house kitchen. The piece was spoiled. He had kept it deliberately, letting it turn in the warm air behind his stove until it smelled of rot. He placed it on the edge of the table where the morning rations were set out, tucked beside the approved pork, and waited for someone to find it. Hannah found it. She was laying out the morning portions, each cup of broth measured on Tom's scale, each bowl of mush scooped from the kettle, each pork sliver cut from the approved barrel and placed on a wooden board. She reached for the board, and her hand touched something wet and wrong. She pulled the piece toward the light and smelled it, and her face changed in the way faces change when the body knows something is dangerous before the mind forms the thought. She did not scream. She did not accuse. She picked up the piece with 2 fingers and carried it to the window. She turned it in the light. She looked at the surface. Then she looked at the approved pork on the board. Tom's pork had a charcoal mark. Every piece cut from an approved barrel carried a faint charcoal line, drawn on the barrel lid before opening and transferred to the meat through handling. It was not intentional branding. It was residue from Tom's inspection marks, a side effect of working with charcoal-marked barrels in a dim vault. But the mark was consistent. Every approved piece had it. The spoiled piece did not. Hannah called Tom. Tom examined the piece. He smelled it. He looked at the surface, pale, slick, with a greenish tinge at one edge. He looked at the charcoal marks on the approved pork. He looked at the piece in Hannah's hand. "This is not from the vault," he said. The kitchen was filling with families for the morning ration. Tom held up the spoiled piece and spoke clearly. "Someone put this here. It did not come from our barrels. It does not carry the inspection mark. It smells of rot from warm storage, not from brine. If anyone had eaten this, they would be sick. I want to know who placed it." Silence. The room smelled of bean broth and guilt. Cale was not in the kitchen. He was in his store, 50 feet away, waiting. But Garrett was there, the teamster Cale had sent to follow Tom weeks earlier, the man who still owed Cale a season's wages. Garrett looked at the floor. Tom did not press. He did not accuse Cale by name. He did not need to. He held up the spoiled piece and the approved piece side by side and let the room see the difference. Then he placed both on the table and said, "The vault's record is open. Every barrel is marked. Every portion is weighed. If you trust that, eat. If you do not, tell me what proof you need and I will provide it." They ate. Every person in that kitchen picked up their bowl and ate, and the spoiled piece sat on the table like a confession that no one had to make because the evidence was visible. Cale heard about it within the hour. He did not come to the boarding house. He did not challenge the accusation that no one had spoken aloud. He opened his store and arranged his diminished stock and waited for customers who increasingly went elsewhere. His leverage was cracking, not broken. Cale still held debts, still controlled hardware and kerosene, and the things the vault could not provide. But the food monopoly was gone. The crisis that should have made him the most powerful man in Bredahl Crossing had instead revealed the limits of his power, and the limits were drawn by a 16-year-old boy with charcoal on his fingers and a widow's pocket scale in his coat. That afternoon, Ada asked Hannah to bring Tom to the boarding house. He came with snow melting off his coat and charcoal on his hands, as always. Ada was sitting by the stove. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not thinner. She had been thin before the winter. Smaller, as if the space she occupied in the world was contracting, pulling inward, making room for an absence that had not yet arrived but was close enough to feel. She held out a folded piece of paper. "Rufus took this from the vault," she said. "The 5th day, during the inspection. I saw him pocket it. I did not say anything because I wanted to see what he would do with it." Tom unfolded the paper. It was the final ledger page, the one that had been nailed inside the wall box, the one he had read by candlelight on the first night. The page listed the vault's purpose in words written 50 years before Tom was born, for use only when the road is gone. But this was a different page. The one Tom had seen was the first page. This was the last, and the last page said more. "Built and sealed by the congregation of the Bredahl Crossing for use when no road, no rail, and no town authority can provide. The stores are for the roadless, the widow, the stranger, and the child first. When the road returns, the stores are to be replenished by those who ate from them in proportion to their means for the next road's closing." Tom read it twice. He read the word "a stranger" and felt something shift in his chest, the way a frozen joint shifts when warmth finally reaches it, not painlessly, but necessarily. The very category the town had used to exclude him, stranger, stray, mouth without a hand, was the category the vault's builders had named first. The roadless, the widow, the stranger, the child. These were not afterthoughts. They were the purpose. "Why did you wait?" Tom asked. "Because if I had shown you that page during the blizzard, you would have waved it at Mott and demanded justice. Justice is slow. Food is fast. I needed you feeding people, not arguing about who the food belonged to." She coughed. "And because I wanted Rufus to have the page long enough to realize that destroying it would not change what it said. Other people read that ledger. Haugen, Mott. They know the words. The page is evidence, not the truth. The truth is in the vault." Tom held the page and said nothing for a long time. Ada reached out and put her hand on his arm. Her fingers were cold. They had been cold for weeks. "You are not a stranger anymore," she said. "But do not forget what it felt like to be one. That is what the vault is for." Tom placed the page inside the vault ledger that night, filed between the daily ration counts and the barrel inspection records. He did not announce it. He did not confront Cale. He filed it as evidence and continued his work, because the town was still hungry and the railroad was still blocked, and there were barrels to check and portions to weigh and people to feed. The page would matter later. For now, the work mattered more. Ada did not return to the vault after that conversation. Her cough deepened through the rest of March. She supervised from the boarding house chair, reviewing Tom's barrel reports, correcting Hannah's ration math, occasionally reaching out to smell a sample of broth brought to her in a cup. Her world contracted to the chair, the stove, the ledger, and the faces of the two young people she had trained to do what she no longer could. She was still teaching. She taught in half sentences now, between coughs, her voice thinner each day. Check the drain before the rain. Mark the date on every barrel you open. If Kel brings you a gift, weigh it. Tom listened. He memorized. He wrote her instructions in the margin of the ration ledger in handwriting that was getting steadier each week, because practice and necessity are the two best teachers of penmanship. The railroad reopened on the 23rd of March. A locomotive pushed through the last quarter mile of drift with a snowplow bolted to its pilot, throwing ice and packed snow in arcs that sparkled in the sun. The sound of the whistle reached Bredahl Crossing before the engine did, and people came out of buildings and stood in the street and listened to it the way sailors listen to a foghorn. Not with joy exactly, but with the deep bone-level relief of knowing that the silence is over and the world still exists beyond the horizon. Supplies arrived the next day. Flour, coffee, salt, kerosene, blankets, nails. The things a town needs to stop merely surviving and begin, slowly, to live. The boarding house kitchen served real bread for the first time in months, and the smell of it baking made 3 women cry, not because they were sad, but because their bodies remembered normal life before their minds could catch up. The vault was not empty. 7 pork barrels remained, 6 bean barrels, 11 wheat stores. Tom did not close it. He did not seal it. He continued daily inspections, continued the ration ledger, continued the charcoal marks. The vault was no longer the only food source, but it was still the reserve, the insurance against the next storm, the next blockage, the next time the road disappeared. Ada smiled when she heard about the train. She did not leave her chair. Spring came to Bredahl, crossing the way spring comes to the Dakota Prairie, not as a gift, but as a negotiation. The snow retreated in stages, revealing mud, then dead grass, then the black earth beneath, each layer surrendering reluctantly to a sun that grew stronger by the day, but never seemed strong enough. Ice cracked on the creek. Water ran where frozen silence had been. The air smelled of thaw and rot and the faint green promise of something growing somewhere beyond the horizon. Tom worked. He worked the way he had worked all winter, early, steadily, without announcement. But the work had changed. The crisis was over. The vault was no longer the only thing between the town and starvation. Supplies came by rail now, irregular but real. Cale's store restocked. Families who had eaten from the vault returned to buying flour and coffee, and the small luxuries that made survival feel like living instead of endurance. The vault remained open. Tom kept the ledger. Hannah kept the ration books. But the daily lines grew shorter. 7 people, then 4, then 2. By April, only the widow Andresen and old Tolaf drew regular portions, and Tolaf came as much for the company as the food. He sat on a barrel in the vault and told Tom stories about the crossing before the railroad, when the ford was the only way across the creek, and wagons backed up half a mile in spring when the water ran high. Tom listened. He listened the way Ada had taught him to listen, not for the story, but for the information inside the story. Tolaf knew the water table. He knew which ground held moisture and which drained clean. He knew where the frost line sat in different soils because he had dug graves in January and cellars in June, and the difference between the two was a matter of purpose, not technique. Tom used this knowledge. He began teaching. The first household he helped was the Haugen farm, 2 miles northwest of town. Peter Haugen wanted a root cellar, not a vault like the church, smaller, simpler, built for a family of 4 and the vegetables they would grow when the ground thawed. Tom walked the property with Haugen and his son, a quiet young man named Sjur, who had the build of a man who had been lifting things since he could stand. Tom chose the site, a north-facing bank behind the farmhouse, where the ground sloped and drainage would run away from the entrance, not toward it. He measured the frost line by driving the pry bar into the earth until the resistance changed, frozen to unfrozen, the boundary his mother had called the line where the earth starts keeping count. They dug for 3 days. Tom, Sjur, and Haugen cutting through still frozen topsoil with picks and prying loose the clay beneath. The hole was 6 feet deep, 8 feet long, 5 feet wide. Tom lined the floor with flat stones hauled from the creek bed and showed Sjur how to set them with a slight pitch toward one corner, where a drainage channel ran through a gap in the wall to a gravel sump outside. He taught as he worked. Choose high ground, not a hollow. Water finds hollows. Food rots in water. He set a stone and checked its level with a straight edge made from a barrel stave. Keep food off damp floors. A raised platform, even 6 inches, is the difference between dry beans and dead beans. He pointed at the 2 vents he had cut into opposite walls. Air from 2 directions. If the air cannot move, the mold can grow. You will smell it before you see it, and by then it is too late. He showed them how to separate storage. Dry grain on one side, wet roots on the other. Never mix them. The grain steals moisture from the roots, and the roots give moisture to the grain, and both of them suffer for it. Sjur asked why the vault under the church had worked for 5 years with no one tending it. Tom said he did not know for certain, but he thought the combination of depth, stone mass, sealed barrels, and the ventilation flue had created conditions stable enough that the food could wait. Not forever. The spoiled barrels proved that, but long enough. It was built right, Tom said. That matters more than wishing. The Haugen cellar was finished by the end of April. It was not beautiful. It was functional. A stone-lined hole in a bank with a wooden door, 2 vents, a drainage channel, and a raised platform inside. Tom inspected it on the last day, walking the interior the way Ada had walked the vault, touching walls, checking the drain, testing airflow with a candle flame. It will hold, he said. Haugen paid him in seed potatoes and a handshake. Tom did not ask for more. By May, he had helped 3 households build cellars. By June, the number was 7. The designs varied. Some were dug into banks, others excavated beside houses. One was a converted dugout that the family had abandoned after the spring flood. Tom adapted the principles to each site. Depth below frost line where possible, drainage always, ventilation always, separation of dry and wet stores always. He charged nothing in cash. He accepted food, labor, and occasionally materials. A saw blade, a bag of lime, a set of hinges that a blacksmith made from scrap iron. The economy of his work was not money. It was trust. Each cellar he built was a cellar that would not fail, and each family that stored food safely through the next winter was a family that told their neighbors, and each neighbor who came to Tom was a person who had heard the story and believed it because the evidence was under their feet. Mott helped. Not with his hands. He was 58, and his back had been stiff since the blizzard, but with his authority. He declared at a town meeting in May that every household with a cellar would receive a property notation on the town ledger, which meant nothing legally but carried weight socially. A cellar was a mark of preparation. A household with a cellar was a household that had learned. Mott also canceled the emergency credit claims that Cale had extracted during the blizzard. He did this quietly in his capacity as board chairman, reviewing each claim individually and determining that debts signed under coercion, sign or your child does not eat, were not valid contracts. Cale protested. Mott showed him the vault ledger with its record of every family that had been turned away from the store and fed from the vault instead. You charged a sewing machine for a cup of flour, Mott said. The law may allow that. The board does not. Cale kept his store. He kept his regular customers. He kept his position in the town's economy because people still needed hardware and kerosene and the 100 small things a general store provides. But his control broke. The monopoly on survival that the blizzard had offered him, the power to decide who ate and who waited, was gone. The vault had broken it. The cellars were burying it. Rufus Cale's final reckoning did not come as a speech or a confrontation. It came as an observation. In June, the cooperative winter store was organized. 12 families pooled resources to buy provisions in bulk from the railroad depot at Tracy, splitting the cost by household size and storing the surplus in the rebuilt church vault. Tom managed the inventory. Hannah kept the books. Pater Haugen contributed the first bushel of new crop wheat. Cale watched the cooperative form. He watched families who had owed him money walk past his store with sacks of flour purchased at depot prices, a third of what he charged. He watched the vault, which he had tried to seize and failed, become the foundation of a system that made his markup irrelevant for staple goods. He came to the vault one evening in late June. Tom was inside, marking new barrels, contributions from the cooperative, freshly sealed, freshly labeled. The hatch was open. Evening light fell through the gap and caught the dust in the air. Cale descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the wall, the way all older men descended because the steps were narrow and steep and the drop was real. He looked at the barrels. He looked at the ledger, open on its shelf, filled with entries in 3 different hands, Tom's, Hannah's, and the cramped notations Ada had made before she could no longer hold a pen. He looked at the stone walls, the drain, the ventilation shaft, the raised platforms that Tom had rebuilt with better lumber since the spring. The boy found more than pork under that church, Cale said. He was not speaking to Tom. He was speaking to the room, to the barrels, to the ghost of a system he had tried to control and could not. He found the part of town we buried. Tom said nothing. He continued marking barrels. Cale climbed the stairs and left. He did not come back to the vault again, though he lived in Bredahl Crossing for another 14 years and sold hardware to every family that built a cellar with Tom's help. His grudging line was not forgiveness. It was not conversion. It was the acknowledgement of a man who understood power, recognizing that he had lost it to a principle he could not buy and a system he could not corner. The vault was not a store. It was a commons. And a commons, by its nature, cannot be owned. Ada Whitcomb died on the 9th of July. She died in the boarding house, in the chair by the stove where she had spent the last 3 months. She died in the morning, with light coming through the window and the sound of children playing in the street outside, a sound that had been absent during the blizzard and had returned with the spring-like birdsong returns, gradually and then all at once. Hannah was with her. Tom was not. He was at the vault, inspecting the cooperative's first full shipment of preserved beans, when Hannah's younger sister Mabel came running across the field between the church and the town with her skirt hiked to her knees and her face the color of ash. Tom climbed the stairs and walked to the boarding house. He did not run. Running would not change what had happened, and he needed the walk, the 10 minutes of putting one foot in front of another on solid ground, to arrange his face into something that would not frighten the people who would be watching when he arrived. Ada was still in the chair. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were folded in her lap, and someone had placed a blanket over her knees, though she no longer needed warmth. The pocket scale was on the table beside her. She had asked Hannah to bring it that morning, before the end, and it sat on the wood surface with its brass pans level and its weights lined up in order, smallest to largest, the way Ada had kept them. Tom picked up the scale. He held it in both hands. The brass was warm from the sun coming through the window. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. Ada had said everything she meant to say weeks ago, parceled out in half sentences between coughs, rationed the way she rationed everything, carefully, precisely, nothing wasted. She had given him the scale and the knowledge and the warning about gratitude and the final ledger page and the instruction to spread the work until it belonged to no one. She had given him everything she had, and what she had was not possessions but methods, and methods cannot be buried. They buried her on the hill above the church, beside her husband. Tom carried one end of the coffin. Peter Haugen carried the other. The service was short because nobody in Bredahl Crossing had a preacher and nobody pretended to be one. Mott read a passage from the vault ledger, the founding purpose, the words about the roadless, the widow, the stranger, and the child, and said that Ada had understood those words better than the people who wrote them. Tom placed the pocket scale inside a glass front case that Shure Haugen built from scrap lumber and a pane of window glass. He set the case on a shelf inside the vault, beside the original ledger, where the brass caught whatever light came down the stairs. After that, the scale did not weigh food. It weighed memory. The summer passed. Tom turned 17. No one celebrated. Birthdays on the prairie were noted, not observed. But Hannah made him a Johnny cake from the new wheat. The first wheat from Bredahl Crossing soil, planted in April, harvested in August, ground in Clara Vale's coffee mill, and left it on the vault shelf beside the scale without a word. Tom ate it alone, sitting on the stairs, and tasted the difference between wheat that had been stored for 5 years and wheat that had been alive in the ground 3 months ago. The new wheat was sweeter. That was the only way he could describe it. The old wheat had kept them alive. The new wheat tasted like the future. By autumn, the pattern was set. October inspections became the town's calendar. Tom visited every cellar before the first killing frost, checking drainage, testing ventilation, examining stored food for moisture and mold. He rejected supplies when he had to. A sack of damp wheat at the Tolliff place, a barrel of poorly sealed pork at the cooperative. And the rejections were accepted because the town had seen what happened when standards were kept and what happened when they were not. The old vault remained the town reserve. It was never again sealed without a public ledger. Every barrel that went in was recorded. Every barrel that came out was accounted for. The door, not a hatch anymore, but a proper door set into a stone frame that Tom and Shure had built over the summer, stayed unlocked. Tom had argued for this. Mott had objected. Tom won the argument with a sentence Otto would have approved. A locked door means one person holds the key. An open door means everyone holds the promise. The promise was simple. In Bredahl Crossing, the first barrel opened in crisis goes to children and the sick. The last barrel closed before winter goes in full, inspected, and marked. The ledger stays open. The vault belongs to no one and serves everyone. Hannah and Tom did not fall in love during the crisis. Nothing so simple. What happened was slower, harder to name, and more durable than romance. They worked together for 5 years. She keeping the books, he building the cellars, both of them teaching the methods to anyone who asked. They argued about ration quantities and barrel procurement and whether the cooperative should extend credit to new settlers who had not yet contributed. They disagreed about politics, about Mott's successor on the town board, about whether the school should teach food storage alongside reading and arithmetic. They agreed about the vault. They agreed about the scale. They agreed about the ledger. Tom proposed when he was 22, not with a speech but with a question asked while they were both standing in the vault, counting barrels for the October inspection. "If I build a cellar on the North Bank claim," he said, "would you keep the books for it?" Hannah looked at him. She had flour dust on her sleeve, the same sleeve that had first made her suspect him 6 years earlier. She understood the question. The North Bank claim was the small plot Tom had filed on after turning 21, 10 acres of good ground with a slope that faced the right direction and soil that drained clean. I would keep the books for it, she said. They married in November in the rebuilt stone structure above the vault, with Mott reading the words and Mabel Vale holding wildflowers dried from September, and the vault door standing open behind them like a promise that had been kept. The cellar Tom built on the north bank was the finest he ever made. Stone-walled, dug 12 feet into the bank with double ventilation, a flagstone floor pitched to a drain, and storage for 800 pounds of mixed provisions. It was the principles of the church vault scaled to a family, and it worked exactly as he designed it. Steady temperature, dry air, clean drainage, food that lasted. Their first child was born the following autumn, a boy. They named him Arnie, after the Mott brother, who had helped haul stone for the original vault and never lived to see it opened. The years compressed the way years do when the work is steady and the crises are smaller. Bad winters came. 1884 was harsh. 1886 was worse, but Bredahl Crossing met them differently. 27 households had some form of below-ground storage by the winter of 1882. By 1885, the number was closer to 40. Full cellars, banked potato rooms, dry grain bins raised off floors, shared barrels in the church vault. The designs were not uniform. Each family adapted the principles to their site, their soil, their needs. But the principles held depth, drainage, ventilation, separation, inspection. Tom taught new settlers when they arrived. He walked their claims, chose their sites, dug with them, and inspected their work. He did not build for them. He taught them to build for themselves, because a cellar you build with your own hands is a cellar you understand well enough to maintain. He charged nothing and accepted everything. A chicken, a day of fence work, a set of door hinges, a handshake. He never became rich. He never tried. Wealth in Bredahl Crossing was measured in preparation, and by that measure, Tom was the wealthiest man in the county, though his cash savings never exceeded what a hired hand might earn in a good year. The town changed around him. The railroad expanded. A second store opened, competing with Kale's, and prices dropped. A school was built. A proper church replaced the makeshift meeting hall. The old vault, the one Tom had found beneath the burned ruins, became the town's central reserve, maintained by a rotating committee, inspected by Tom each October, stocked by the cooperative before every winter. The old insult changed meaning. Children no longer said church rat. They called the rebuilt stone structure above the vault the warm door. The name stuck because it was accurate. The door stayed warm in winter, heated from below by the earth's steady breath. And people who touched it in January felt the same thing Tom had felt on that first night when his eyelashes thawed and the dark below smelled of dry earth and old wood. Hannah kept the books until their third child was born, then trained 2 younger women to share the work. She ran the cooperative's purchasing committee and fought with suppliers in Tracy over bulk prices with a precision that Ada would have admired and Cale would have feared. She never let anyone forget that the ration system worked because it was transparent, and she never let the ledger close. Tom kept Ada's scale on his desk. Every autumn, when the first wheat contribution came in from the cooperative, he weighed it himself. Not because it needed weighing. The cooperative had proper scales by then, factory-made, accurate to the ounce. He weighed it on Ada's brass balance because the ritual mattered, the small weights clicking into their pans, the beam leveling, the number recorded, the process witnessed. He slept lightly his entire life. Sleet on a roof woke him every time, and he would lie in the dark, listening until the sound became familiar enough to ignore, and sometimes it never did. In old age, Tom returned to the vault during the first snow of a new winter. He descended the stairs, slower now, one hand on the wall, the way Ada had descended and Tolef had descended, and every person who was no longer young descended those narrow steps. The vault was larger than it had been. The cooperative had expanded the southern alcove and added a second chamber. New barrels lined the walls. The ledger, the fourth volume, the first three stored in the glass case beside the scale, lay open on the shelf. Below him, he heard children counting sacks aloud. 2 girls and a boy, grandchildren of families he had fed during the blizzard, tallying the winter's stock for the October inspection. Their voices echoed off the stone walls, high and clear, reciting numbers that meant survival to people who understood them, and nothing more than numbers to children who had never been hungry enough to learn the difference. The sound was ordinary, small voices counting sacks in an underground room that smelled of dry earth and old wood. That was the victory, not a dramatic rescue, not a vindication speech, not the defeat of an enemy, just the ordinary, unremarkable sound of preparation being passed from one generation to the next, in a town that had learned to open its doors because a boy with no claim to warmth had opened a door they had forgotten existed. By the winter of 1882, 27 households around Bredahl Crossing had some form of below-ground storage. Tom Rourke inspected everyone before the first killing frost. The church vault, rebuilt, expanded, maintained by a committee of 6, was never again sealed without a public ledger. The rule carved into the lintel above the new stone door read, "The first barrel opened in crisis goes to children and the sick." Below it, in smaller letters that Tom had chiseled himself on a cold October morning, were 3 words from the original founding page. "And the stranger." Tom Rourke lived his life in Bredahl Crossing. He kept Otto Whitcomb's pocket scale on his desk and weighed each autumn's first wheat contribution himself, long after the cooperative had no need of a handheld balance. He taught food storage and cellar building to new settlers until his hands could no longer grip a pry bar, and after that he taught by pointing and watching and shaking his head when the drainage pitch was wrong. He died in his sleep during a late March thaw, with sleet tapping his roof and the scale on the desk beside his bed, and Hannah found him in the morning with one hand open as if he had been reaching for something in the dark. In January, when the temperature dropped below 0 and sleet drove sideways across the rail yard, Rufus Cale had said, "If we feed every stray boy off the rails, we will bury our own children by March." In March, children carried warm bean broth from the rebuilt stone storehouse past Cale's shuttered windows. Elias Mott took off his hat before entering the vault. Hannah Rourke marked the ledger, and beneath the stone floor, in the chamber where the earth kept its own weather, the barrels sat on their blocks in the dry dark, counted and sealed and waiting, the way they had waited for years before Tom Rourke pressed his hand to the floor and felt the warmth that everyone else had walked over without noticing. The town survived because the boy they would not shelter found the door they had forgotten to open,